And let's get started. I think let's begin with a round of introductions. So Kim, we could perhaps begin with you and then take it through.
Yes, good morning. And first of all, I would like to apologize for not laying Leonard Cohen voice, which have hit me for the last few days. I will survive. I'm with Actavis, and Actavis used to be a pure generic. Now we are specialty pharma. You have all heard the stories, and you know that through acquisitions we have grown quite a lot through the last 1 or 2 years. It's part of the generic story, I guess, but we'll come back to that, what's happening in generics and what's next.
Morning, everyone. Yeah, my name is Subir Kohli. I work for Dr. Reddy's. I look after the UK business and the European business development side. And looking forward to a good discussion around generics, what's next today. So hopefully share a few insights about what the organization is thinking and how we see the industry shaping up.
Good morning. I'm Rory O'Riordan. I'm Executive Director at DCC Vital, which is a name I suspect most of you haven't heard. I've been in pharmaceuticals for about 30 years, about 15 on the generic side, and we've just started to develop into this area. So I'm kind of working for a new guy in the block rather than a long-established player.
Good morning, all. My name is Mohit Singh. I work for a company called Pharma Integrates. I'm responsible for business development for North America and Europe. My last company was AstraZeneca, so I did have an opportunity to look at the generic space from a different perspective. So hopefully I'll be able to give a couple of different perspectives to this discussion. Thank you.
Thanks, Mohit. Well, thank you. And I'm not Ewan. My name's Rahul Garela. I head up the business for Power Pharmaceuticals. It's an American generics company. And previously, I headed up Glenmark's business in Europe and set that up from scratch. So hopefully, we'll have something interesting. I'd like it to be as interactive as possible. So if you have questions, please do put your hands up and just give us your company name and yourself, and we're more than happy to take those questions. So as they say, the best way to predict the future is to invent it. And generics have always had it a little easier in that sense, because the industry has always had a list of patent expiries well into the future. And it's had that fairly well mapped out. And it's worked very well. But I think today, several years down the road, it's no longer the same industry as it started out. And what we'd like to do is, with this panel, explore how it's changed, what are the trends that will impact the future growth, really what the industry looks like in the eyes and views of these panelists, and through that, plan out and map out what the future might potentially look like. So let me just, throw the floor open with, what would you think is the generics industry today? It's a very general question, but I think all of us will have actually a different view on what the industry is all about. So Kim.
Then I'll go back and say what was it and why did we come here? And we have to go 30 years back in time where we had a change in regulation in the US opening up for generic molecules and generic products. The whole generic industry is, I guess, 15 years old. It opened up that time, but I mean it's about 15 years when we really got a lot of products to the markets and working with the regulators, and a lot of things happened during this time. And the landscape was, you have big molecules, they're going off patent, you can produce this molecule, and everybody believed that if we do this, then we could take a certain market share and the price would not go as far down as we saw it would. So there was some expectations for the generic industry 15 years ago, which is different today for sure. We did not believe that pharmaceuticals would be a commodity, which it has basically become. A commodity price-wise, but not quality-wise. We are still living up to the same quality standards as we have to do, but still that changed some thoughts of the mind of people and say, well, if this is really true, then I need to grow, because I cannot live from a small country or small market. So I need to have bigger volumes in order to get better COGS, to be a better partner, to be able to buy raw materials. We have been into all of this value stream also here, and the price competition pressure, of course, from the authorities was also there. And this like wolves, when they saw somebody bleeding, they were just stamping even more on it and say, we want more from the generics, so we want lower prices, and they got it. So I think we are now at the end of this journey. We do not see a lot of easy to make generic molecules going off patent. We do not see a low entrance fee for the new molecule to come. So we see a different world to come. And of course, the people working in generic industry also came from the originator back in time. If we have been here for 30 years as I have, then you have been working for the other side also. But we know and have learned through this that we have to be agile and have to look into new possibilities and try to find out where do we want to be in the future. And we still want to be in generics. I mean, in some markets, 75% of all tablets handed over the desk is coming from generic suppliers. From a financial perspective, it's much less, but the volume-wise, it's a big thing. And the patients are really seeing our products every day. So we'll still be there. But we also have to do something else. And this is, of course, for each company to decide where do we want to go. And this is where I see that our ways, where we have been going very much together, we will go part of it together, and we will take different routes also.
Okay, thank you. And of course, Actavis did the massive Allergan acquisition. Whether it'll stay as Actavis, will it be called Allergan?
What do you say? I think for the first, when Watson took over Actavis, they looked into the name and said, well, we cannot call an international company Watson. So they looked into different opportunities and found the name Actavis. What's going to happen with Allergan, I don't know. But we do know that brand has a value. And you don't throw away a brand until you are sure that you have taken the value out of it.
Sure. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Kim. I can't talk about the last 30 years, but the last 15 years, I can say that the things have absolutely changed in the market, and pretty much along the lines of what you said. There is this, generics are here to stay. Actually, that's pretty much a done thing. You will still see patents expire. You will still see the need for affordable medicines out there, whether it's emerging markets, whether it's developed markets. So generics are here to stay. But what's happening, as we see it now, is a natural segmentation of the market, as a lot of us see it, where the big generic players, Teva's, Actavis of the world, are talking about brand play. They're talking about a slightly different end of the spectrum. Then there is the second-tier companies who are talking about niche, complex products, higher barriers to entry. So that's one end of the spectrum. And the third piece, which is the me to commodity play, will always stay. There'll always be a raft of companies who will want to play that game. And I think that natural, kind of a segmentation is becoming more and more evident now as we see the market shaping up. And then also, just to add to that, there is always a market play and a product play. So some companies are choosing to operate in certain markets, whereas the others are exiting, saying it doesn't meet our thresholds. Actavis in particular, Western European markets, you've exited. It's just one example. Some of them are saying emerging markets is where we want to be. It's a branded play, slightly more profitable. Whereas other companies are saying, no, that's too risky, whether it's currency issues or just general compliance issues. They don't want to play in those markets. So I think clearly you'll see companies taking a very different view of things going forward, whether it's from a product segment or a marketplace. So it'll be an interesting next few years to see how the market shapes up.
Thanks. I've been in the generic sector for about 15 years, and it is certainly now a mature industry. The days of being able to launch a day after patent expiry, you make margins of 60% for about 6-7 months, and then get whittled down to 40% and keep that as a branded generic for a couple of years are long gone. So the days of making easy millions is certainly over. And I think when you see the moves of large players like Tower Activists buying into branded companies rather than gobbling up more generic companies, it indicates that that idea of growth simply by acquisition of pure generics just doesn't deliver decent returns anymore. Also, the definition has changed. 10 years ago there were the good guys, and then there were the generic companies who were purloining the industry. You look at Pfizer, and they're a generic company. You look around the world, and even the Amgens of this world are developing generic medicine. So the definition has changed very rapidly. What is still very interesting about this business is that the fundamentals are very strong. There's continuous growth in healthcare. No matter what we do, there'll be growth in healthcare and medicines. And the payer is very much in place. So certainly in the mature markets of North America and Europe, the governments are interested and involved in paying for healthcare. Now that's two very strong fundamentals that you won't get in many other industries. And I think that's what brought a lot of us into this industry and maintains it. As long as the fundamentals are in place, you can always carve out a good living.
Thanks, Rory. Yeah, I think I probably don't have any different views than that generics is a very interesting industry to be in. Clearly, I think it's not as easy as Rory mentioned as it was in the past. But I feel the macros are still in place. Pharma as an industry has helped people live longer. And if you see the emerging markets, there's a huge potential of growth. And I think that's where we all know, I think Alan will probably agree with me that the biggest growth in the future is going to come from emerging markets. So I think emerging markets and also in the established world where the generic penetration is still quite low. I think those are the two big growth possibilities in my opinion. The other part is that how do different companies look at the generic industry? We saw activists pulling away from some of the major Western European markets, but we saw Aurobindo coming into the picture and taking it and saying that this is an opportunity for us. We see companies trying to get into emerging markets and then failing, but then we also see other companies who are traditionally strong in emerging markets are going into more emerging markets and trying to increase their market share. So overall, I think the fundamentals are there, and I think the generic industry is here to stay. Yeah.
Thank you, and I think, of course, through this amalgamation, this evolution, there are lots of things that that are coming up. Consolidation certainly is one of the key elements that define the maturity of the industry, and I'd be quite interested to hear, from all of you, your views on consolidation. I mean, I picked up some broad numbers. The top 4 generic companies, and by the way, this is prior to the Allergan acquisition. So Teva, Sandoz, Actavis, and Mylan, between them have cumulative revenues of $31 billion and a share of over 15% globally of the entire generics industry. So that's quite a huge number. And over time, this probably will go up. I'd be quite interested to hear your views on where you see consolidation happening, what trends do you foresee, and what implications does this have for the industry? And we can reverse the order if you prefer.
Yeah, why not give Mohit the chance to,
sure.
Instead of saying, I agree with the rest of the panel. Then I can
So maybe then I'll take it probably the other way around. My personal view is that yes, M&A is happening. My personal view is that consolidation, I don't see consolidation. I recently had the opportunity to look at some IMS data in terms of units. And as I said, I look after parts of Europe and North America. So I looked at the last 3 years, 11, 12, 13 IMS data for units. And I don't see the market share of the top 5 players change much. there has been some changes year on year. You could agree that some maybe they pulled out of certain products or they had some more launches compared to others. But overall, I did not see the market share numbers change a lot for the big players. So the big are probably getting a bit bigger, but there is still this huge space left for several other companies to compete in. Mm-hmm. So I think that's my view.
Okay.
Yeah, I think merger and acquisition will continue because it's still a very fractionated industry. The numbers that you quote, that they hold 15% of the market, that's tiny compared to many other industries where, look at the oil industry, 7 companies dominate the global industry. There's a lot of room to go if that's your business model. And I think what you'll see is in southern European countries where there are still a lot of national companies, they can't stick the heat. Their governments are moving towards commoditized policies, and their model is branded generics in a region, and they will be gobbled up by people who are just fundamentally better structured. I think in the emerging markets where we're all attracted by the growth rates, it's probably wise to buy something because you buy local knowledge. Simply ploughing into Brazil without understanding how it works is a recipe for disaster. I think those will be not pointing the finger at anybody. I think those will be the main motivations around acquisitions, to grow by market share and to grow to gain market intelligence and bring your products through a well-organized company into those emerging markets.
Yeah. No, and just to add, actually, Roy, good point. So you'll see consolidation for market footprint, like acquisition locally in Brazil, for example, and you'll also see more M&A in terms of which end of this, again, going back to my initial comment, which end of the spectrum you want to play. And you've seen a lot of acquisitions, small ones from companies like Dr. Reddy's, like Lupin for specialist injectable play, liposome specialist technologies. So you'll see that kind of play as well, in addition to the general expansion of market footprint, trying to get local expertise. But the other side of consolidation, which we talked about earlier, I think was about the trade and our customers, and we're seeing that consolidation affect market dynamics as well. And I'm talking about Walgreens Alliance Boots, I'm talking about Celesio and McKesson's. I think that is definitely affecting the play for, at least definitely for generics in the market across the board. I think that with customers getting bigger, the trade getting bigger, their buying power. I mean, we talk about Walgreens buying some $100 billion of pharmaceutical products. I mean, that's big. That's big.
And considering that maybe a few years ago you had 10 people you could go to sell your product, now you only have 4 or 5. Yeah. So clearly, if you're with them, you get 20% market share. Yeah. If you're not, you're out. And I think that's quite an important trend. It's certainly happening in the US. Yeah. It's happening in across the Atlantic, with these alliances, Walgreens, Boots. They call themselves WeBad.
Yes, exactly.
Appropriately.
Very appropriately.
And also with Celesio McKesson, But I think that probably will only accelerate and add to that. And likewise, I think in terms of the retail, a lot of Southern European countries, in fact many countries across Europe, don't have a consolidated retail channel, of the kind we see either in the States or here in the UK. So do you think there will be consolidation on a retail pharmacy level?
What we have seen is that for 15 years back in time, the wholesalers was wholesalers. Now the wholesalers are our customers, and we have to please them. And they have grown. Some of the wholesalers also own the pharmacies. So if you want to be able to do anything, you really have to be there. So the question is also, what is their game? Do they want to buy themselves more into the health chain because they could do that? They are big animals. That's not for me to say because I'm not sitting there, but they could do lots of things which we are not doing and could not do. Another thing was mergers and acquisition. We've been talking about that, and we started doing the purchase to get more volume. I mean, that was the driving factor. We need more volume. Yeah. So the idea was, with more volume, you have lower COGS, and with lower COGS, you have more competitiveness in the market. Makes sense. now where we are now, I think that you have 4 dominating generic players, and I fully agree. The market shares will not change much because nobody wants one which is so much bigger than the other. So if you're having 30% of the market share, you will not grow. I mean, it's like that. The purchasers will see too that there is a balance. They don't want to have one dominating partner. So that will also regulate itself by what we are seeing. But you still need to do good organic growth, and you need to do good business. So you need to know what you are focusing at. So don't forget to do your job, your daily job, where you are selling your pharmaceuticals and where you are attending your customers and the needs of what they're doing. So you are an attractive partner for them. Yeah. So after having Allergan and Forest Lab in the family, we are back into Europe with a different portfolio, in a different model. Yeah. And we are happy that we have a different model in Europe. I think how many companies have just said, no, I don't want to sell my products in Southern Europe? Out. Not so many, but it shows that there are some will in our industry to take some decisions which are controversial. I mean, taking over a bit of Allergan from the price of 66 billion. I mean, this is also quite a bold move, I would say. I'm sure that we will have a nice time together, but I wouldn't have thought about that half a year ago. So things are moving fast, but I do see some very nice moves for activists in doing this. We are differentiating us. We are essentially different, you can say, not essentially identical, which is a normal word for generics. And we will continue to do that, but we will definitely, as you're saying, we will keep our base, our core portfolio of generics, and we will make use of both, and we will play with the synergies between the portfolios. And that is going to be our game. How we're going to do it will be for us to decide.
Yeah, fair. And in a manner of speaking, while companies like Teva, activists, all started from the same focal point, the trajectories today are quite divergent. Models are evolved. So if we look at activists, perhaps it's more in terms of market position, market strength, and then acquiring companies is probably the right way to do that. The others have gone down the technology road in terms of more the back end, the competence, and building up some of those skill sets with a view to having, differentiated novel products. The Teva NME model, for instance.
Yeah. We had the long discussion. Do we want to be back integrated to APIs, or do we want to be the biggest API purchaser in the world? Yeah. And we say, well, we don't have the skills. So why would it make sense for us to use all our efforts there? We have the skills in the marketing, we know the marketplace, and there are a lot of big pharma. I mean, I really see the skills of pharma in the marketing world. I'm just sorry that our reputation towards the people is not better, because we are doing great things. Perhaps we should, in our organizations, do something about marketing of the pharmaceutical world towards patients.
Very interesting.
Maybe, Rahul, just a short comment on, I think it was started by Subir, about this aggregation of customers. I think, yes, it must be giving nightmares to some companies, or probably many companies in the US, but I'm not very sure if this cross-Atlantic acquisitions which is happening, whether that is necessarily going to change the landscape here in Europe. Because fundamentally, the products are more often than not quite different. So you have completely different SKUs, different products, sometimes even a different kind of release profile. So I'm not sure if that's going to affect the relationship or your outlook towards buyers in Europe because of these consolidations which are happening. Yeah. So just wanted to.
I think the only point there, Mohit, is we're seeing that commercially. So they're not talking about product similarities. They're saying commercially, if you want to buy X million from Teva across both sides of the pond, this is how they are big now. Okay, so what they're trying to say is, we want to work with fewer suppliers, not broaden our base too much, and hence it's only you've got to make the cut. So I think we'll see some dynamics change because of that consolidation.
Sure.
and some companies will get affected, the others may not get affected. But I think the bigger boys will grow because they will, the Alliance Walgreens, the McKessons are very clear about how they want to take the buying between US and Europe and kind of merge the two into one consolidated buying team, basically. So I think that will affect the dynamics of your
Definitely will be some effect,
Yeah.
Just one thing, I think I don't know the numbers at all, so maybe it wouldn't make a lot of sense, but I read about McKesson, the McKesson Celesio deal, about the synergies that they were trying to predict after the deal happened. It was pretty low. And even that, the big part of the synergies that they were trying to predict, a big chunk of that was coming from cost synergies. So overall, I think even they are not looking at it in a big way. So, yeah, I mean, you are right. There will be some effect clearly, but I don't think it will be, earth-shattering.
A big change that I've seen in terms of the generic companies is the move away from trying to provide one of everything that ever went off patent to a more sustainable catalogue of products. I mean, a couple of years ago, all these conferences were, what's the next big thing off patent and who's going to get there first? And I think Lipitor showed us that actually nobody won in the end. Everybody had it on the day of patent expiry. The price fell calamitously. And if you were in it, you had to stay in it. But if you hadn't got into it, you didn't miss out. And when you look at companies who have maybe over 1,000 products for an offer, typically they make money on a third of them. They break even on a third of them. They lose money on the other third of them. And with the customers concentrating their purchasing power, that loss is going to be even greater because you can only really work on the products that you make yourselves in terms of COGS improvements. The others, you're stuck with third-party manufacturing costs. So I think you're going to see companies, both big and small, saying, I'm going to focus on the products that I can make money reliably, predictably, not enormous, but for the next 5 years rather than the next 5 weeks. And that's why markets like the US and the UK are proving constantly interesting, even if companies drop out of Germany, because there is price flexibility up and down, whereas there's very little of that anywhere outside those two markets. I mean, a month ago, a US company came to me because they wanted to bring levothyroxine to Europe because they were getting $88 a bottle in the US. Now, if you get 88 pence here, you'll be doing that. It just gives you some idea of the opportunities in older molecules, because the interesting thing is that when products go off patent, their actual consumption increases because they're now more affordable to a wider population. And you look at drugs as old as atenolol or penicillin, they've gone up consistently for 70 years, even though there are new drugs coming along and so on. So, I heard a definition once that a brand is actually just the initial temporary form of a product, and that its long-term life of maybe 70 years is actually the generic form, and that volume grows and grows. So if you're well positioned around the API and the manufacture of the product, that can be a long-term sustainable business for you. And I think that's what companies are looking at, sustainable business rather than the next big thing that's off patent. Because really, after Lipitor, nothing's ever going to be as big as that again. That was as easy to do, I should say.
That's a really good point, Rory. And actually linked with that, the whole costs piece and making sure that you've got the best costs for the molecules you wish to operate in is clearly one element of that strategy. Is there a room for branding? Do we see, and this is the question I have, do you see in your companies as a strategy the element of actually bringing branded products to market? We hear a lot about this, and of course Actavis has been one of the front runners on this. But is there a scope for generic companies to play in the branded space?
I hope so.
If not,
66 billion, is it?
I do believe in brands. And I do believe that when we are selling a product called INN dot something, then we are confusing more than we are helping. The payers want it. The payers are the authorities or the health insurance funds, because then they can say this is like for like, and they can play the price game. The patients are confused. I mean, I have a mother-in-law, I had a mother-in-law, and she had some medicine, and I went to the pharmacy and I bought it for her, and I brought the generic version home because it was cheaper. And she said, well, I know you're a
And because it was your mother-in-law.
Yeah, I know you're a pharmacist, he says, so I do believe it's just as good, but it's not the same product. I say, what do you mean it's not the same product? It's identical. And they say, well, Kim, try to break the tablets, because I normally take half a tablet. I don't like to take a full tablet. I couldn't break the tablet because there was no score line, but in the originator's product there was a score line. So she said, that I told you, it's not the same product. And that's what we're doing to people. We're giving them different products, different shapes, different colors, different size. For the patients, it's not identical. We're so much into our own world that we say, well, of course it's the same product because we have proven to the authorities it's the same, but it's not. And people are taking wrong products because they are shifting from one supplier to another supplier. Brands would help them.
But Kim, sorry. But Kim, you said that that we know it so well. It's so obvious to us. It's not obvious to the patients. So does the answer lie in patient education?
Perhaps, yes. But we're not allowed to really go to the patient, so we have a problem here. So here we need some creativity. How do we do this?
Yeah.
I'm not saying that we cannot do it, because we just had a discussion here. We're not going to say that. So we need to use the right side of the brain and be creative and say, how do we do this?
The challenge, I mean, I'd say most companies involved in generics salivate at the idea of having a brand, either by buying a company or buying the brand. Because it seems to be stable, seems to be higher margin than what you're making yourself, seems to be easy. The problem is you only get to that position by being able to market it to prescribers. Yeah. And most generic companies are not reaching prescribers, they're reaching dispensers. Exactly. So very often they buy these things and then think, now I have to go off and hire sales force, and those guys are expensive. So I suspect buying a company that already has that capability is a much more efficient way of exploiting the value in the brand. But you often see, sell-offs by big pharma. A product is below a certain turnover and it's a pain in the neck for them. And somebody buys it and thinks, great, I'll extract lots of value. In fact, the brand dies because they don't nurture themselves. Even though they're long-lasting, you do have to maintain confidence in a brand. I think that's the point Kim's making, that his mother-in-law knew what she wanted. She didn't need a pill to tell her, or as in patient leaflet. She wanted what she always wanted, and that's the value of brand ultimately.
Yeah, I think the common theme here is profitability. For the generics market, profitability is a massive concern. How do you go about changing that? You're looking at, everyone's talking about brands, and I think it's a bit of a misnomer here, because sometimes people talk about branded generics, and sometimes they talk about brands like the Allergan acquisitions. I think it's important to be able to differentiate the two, and as we look at branded generics, as the barriers go up, we talk about biosimilars. By very nature, these products need to be branded. Some of the specialist injectable drugs, and that's the play that some of the generic companies are looking at more closely, which is getting closer to the prescriber, not just the dispenser, but also the brand, hoping that there is a little more sustainability in sales and profitability. I think that's key.
I think in Pharmathen, I can clearly say that we are looking at the branded generic opportunity in a big way. I mean, big for us is relatively small for somebody else, but we are clearly looking at it in a big way. This is one of our key cornerstone pillars of future growth. We are looking at geographic expansion, and hence the US. We are looking at, of course, expanding our R&D capacity to develop more and more generics. But the middle pillar is where we are looking at the high development barrier, high marketing barrier products, and a part of those are products which will be differentiated by design. So we're looking at either a patient convenience, changing the form. We are looking at creating a new indication. In fact, we are also looking at things like taking old products and looking at pediatric indications possibilities. So we are definitely looking at this opportunity in a big way.
And of course, I think in an ideal world, everybody would want to trade off uncertainty with certainty, and brands tend to bring that certainty because you don't have the dips on a monthly basis of sales being here or sales being there. It brings that. So investors always love that, but there is an acquisition cost to getting that sustainability, and many companies are able to afford that.
Yeah.
Many others are unable to. And I think the other element in terms of a very different skill set, if you're talking to a dispenser vis-a-vis talking to a prescriber, you need a different skill set, you need different teams, you need a very different package. And in some markets, like for instance here in the UK, the clinical commissioning groups may like your product, but it still needs to have commercial value for them in order for them to have the prescribers prescribe that. So I think it's a fine line. The question really I had was are generic companies able to bridge that gap? Some clearly have and have actually moved on to the other side. Activists perhaps will have 10-20% of its revenues through generics, pretty much everything else through branded products. But of course, not everybody is in the same boat. So do you believe that that will happen over the next 3 to 5 years?
No, I think some companies will go down the branded route, either by acquisition or acquiring brands, because they feel that the business is more predictable, and therefore they won't see these volatile spikes. But a lot of companies just don't have that skill set, or frankly don't have the financial firepower to spend 66 billion. Activists and Teva are in a certain global position, and so you have to do with what you can within your resources. I think that the skill set around managing brands, if you've been on that side of the industry, is a very useful asset if you've gone into generics, because you can select certain products that will respond to it. Other products won't. I mean, people who, say, pursue branded generics in Spain are barking up a gum tree because the state does not want to pay a premium for branded generics. So you're just kind of pushing against the tide. But in certain markets, such as the UK, where the state wants branded cardiovasculars, then you've got the government behind you endorsing that strategy. So you've got to be clever about where you pursue brands. But I think when one of the topics we have here is about growth. At the moment, all of us have to move from small molecule chemistry to bigger molecule chemistry. The glory days of small molecule chemistry are over. I think 8 out of the top 10 products in Europe are biologicals. And so if you're still focused on trying to make money from simvastatin, you're left in the dust. You've got to figure a way to be in the growth market, whether you do it yourself or partner with somebody. But if you're not in the highest growing part, you're not in the game anymore. You're really left in the dust. And I think that's what's confronting a lot of companies who are interested to grow their business, because that's really what brings investors, is have you a growth strategy? And if you're saying, I'm going to focus on stuff that's flat or declining, that doesn't attract people.
But Roy, this is where the issue is. You just talked about financial muscle power.
Yeah.
Most companies wouldn't have that for investing into the biosimilar products. Right?
Well,
so that's the debate that's raging within generic board houses.
I think when you look at Valiant and Actavis in the last couple of years, your rate of acquisition and your spending has been phenomenal. And it's because you've been able to persuade people with money that you have a plan to grow their money.
That's right.
So if you have a good plan, there's money out there. There's a wall of money looking for a place. Interest rates are on the floor. So anybody with any kind of resources is saying, has anybody a better idea what to do with my millions than what I have leaving it in a bank? So if you have a coherent plan, I think access to money isn't that difficult. It's having the coherent plan is the persuasive part.
And you need to have your organic growth plan, as you said.
You have to manage the assets you already have.
You need to do your daily business. You cannot just focus on acquisition. If you're doing that, buying companies and just leaving them alone, and then you'll see a decline in the market share of the old products, then I think it will be difficult to get money.
And while some companies taking baby steps, the others are going to go straight up the value chain.
Yeah. And if I can just maybe pause here for a moment to ask if there are any questions from the audience.
Brian Fairley from Johnson Matthey. There's been a lot of good discussion today about the pressures that the generic industry is facing, a lot about the consolidation that's ongoing. We spoke earlier, the panel gave some good thoughts on strategic partnerships. What does the panel feel the opportunities are for the generic industry in regards to strategic partnerships moving forward?
I think that's a great question. I do see a lot of strategic partnerships happening in the generic industry. especially in the more difficult to do products, respiratory products, some of those where there is a barrier beyond the solid oral dose products, which will need an influx of technology or competence to help bridge that gap and in order to operate there. But I'd like to hear what the panel also has.
Yeah, I can take a shot at this because I think my company Pharmathen is essentially built on partnerships. We do market our products in essentially our home market in Greece, but essentially our business is based on partnerships, strategic and opportunistic. For companies like us, I think it's our bread and butter to make products which differentiate us from others. We just can't do everything, but we try and do things which make more sense to our customers, and then pitch those products to customers who could be our strategic partners. They may not be the biggest companies in the world, they could be in the second rung, middle tier, they could be a regional strong player, but this is how we do our business. So I think from my perspective, yes, this is where we are looking at developing difficult to make products, increasing our basket, and looking at proper partners with whom we can have long-term relationships with.
Yeah, I can give you another example of partnership, and it's between the API industry and we're mostly the finished dosage industry. Mm-hmm. And typically what you do is you haggle with API guys and you try and get a price per kilo for the raw material, and you go up and down the road saying I can't afford it and they can't afford to sell it. We've a beta-lactam facility, and so we've partnered with two, which is relatively narrow range of APIs. We've partnered with two companies who've said, let's just gain share in the markets that we're in, and we'll follow the price up and down. So if it's high in Germany, we'll share that with you in terms of the split between the API and the finished dosage. And if it's low in another country, we'll share the pain with you. But at least you're not spending time and energy going in and out of price negotiations when what you should be focusing on is gaining market share. And that ultimately employs all of your capacity and all of their API capacity, and it gives you that predictability thing I was talking about. If an API producer knows that he's going to sell us 100 tons of Amoxi every year, that's put to bed. He doesn't have to worry about that anymore. So the actual price of it doesn't really matter that much. The fact is he has capacity utilization that he can clear off. And I think that works very well. So you're working aligned with your partner rather than trying to make a buck off one another, because in the end it's the share of the market that you get collectively that really works for you.
Yeah.
Strategic partnerships definitely the way to go. You can't do it all. Clearly, none of these organizations, at least on the generic side, you can't do it all. So we're seeing more and more strategic partnerships either on the technology front, whether it's product development, manufacturing, and also on the selling side. You don't have the same geographical footprint. And I'm thinking of a couple of examples, like Dr. Reddy's has partnered up with the Merck Serono for the biosimilar side, which is a bit of both. So learning from their technology capabilities, but also using their financial muscle power and their geographical footprint and their expertise on the branded side. So you'll see more of these partnerships happening across the board. I'm pretty certain that's the way to go.
And one thing that I like very much, what I've seen is, again, going back in time when we were doing in-licensing agreement with partners, they were selling, of course, the same agreement to all our competitors. These days are also about to be over. We are now doing, and more from both sides, exclusive agreements or agreements where you are covering some countries and not all countries. But I mean, you cannot be a really strategic partner if the partner is selling the strategic product through your competitor in the same market. It doesn't work for us. So I mean, it goes both ways.
I think, to be honest, Kim, this is a very valid point. This is one of the reasons which is driving Pharmathen to develop products which are much more difficult. Because if you develop a generic, you will end up partnering with 20 different companies because you also want to increase your market share. You also feel that if you don't do it, somebody else would do it, so why don't you do it? But when you go into this difficult to make products, that's where you as a company, you as a licensor would want your licensee to have the majority of the market share, and you don't want to populate the market with too many players. So that's one of the other reasons why we are looking at those products in order to inculcate these strategic partnerships, so as to say.
And the very nature of these strategic partnerships is on the basis of trust. So, I think if companies have worked together in the past, they have had that track record of knowing each other well, culturally being aligned, it certainly helps make that process a lot easier. I mean, we, for instance, put a huge investment in an API plant, and we are not into APIs at all, because that was a strategic product for us for being first to market in the US. And it took between 3 to 4 years to see the fruit of that investment come through. But then you take a view and you stick with it, and then so they probably are, it's a longer gestation. It needs a lot more trust, and it has to be strategic.
Alan Mayer, Biovia. There's been a lot of talk on the M&A question about markets and volumes and brands. In other sectors, M&A is often about taking cost out of businesses, making businesses efficient, restructuring, and so on. How does that play out in the generics sector?
It does. Ask Valiant. That's what they're doing.
I think that's a great question. Valiant, of course, is perhaps again less of a generics company today than it was 5 years ago. But I think that's a great question. The ability to dress up a balance sheet through acquisitions or through things such as inversion. I mean, inversion has also had its role to play in terms of American companies acquiring European companies to get a lower tax structure. And we see this on a very large scale, including in generics, with the Mylan acquisition. But my personal view is that that's not such a big driver in the generic space as it is in big pharma, where it's all about driving productivity, acquiring products, cutting out the SG&A expenses if you're overlapping on markets, and things like that. I think generics is trying to get into some of those segments, so it's looking at those acquisitions to build another capability and build infrastructure where it doesn't have, for most part.
I can say that from all the mergers and acquisitions that I've been living through in my 11 years in Activision, that is quite a few. I've seen many different aspects. The last fewer ones, definitely the synergies was in R&D and in finance. I mean, how many finance people are really consolidating? I mean, this is amazing. So
do we have any finance people?
So, but this is where we had some synergies for sure, and for the generic companies, when a generic company is taking over another generic company, they basically have the same products in the R&D pipeline. So I mean, R&D is more D than R, and of course there's a synergy there because you don't need it. So there are something there. Could also be some production issues. But what we have been doing has primarily been buying ourselves into markets where we did not have any presence. And if we couldn't buy ourselves in, we tried to start up. And we started ourselves up in South Europe. And that proved to be more difficult than to buy yourself into something in South Europe. So you see, M&As are there for a good reason. It does have a cost, and it does have a payback. We have also taken over tail-end products from Roche, which we have been selling for a long time. So it's not just M&As, but also taking over brands from pharma, where they can say, well, we have milked them to the level where we don't want more. So if you are willing to pay so and so, we are willing to sell it, and that we have also done. And for us, it made sense because we had a revenue stream in countries where we were not, and we could set up ourselves there. So, I mean, there are many good reasons why a product doesn't make sense for one and makes a lot of sense for someone else.
I would say synergies are always on the table when you see an acquisition. You rarely get all of the synergies you hope for because there's a wrinkle, maybe more than one wrinkle. But I think the reason that merger and acquisition happens in the generic space is not purely just the cost-saving benefits. You go to buy something because it gains you extra product, extra market share, extra relationships even. And then the added benefit is you can save on some back office costs. But it's rarely the reason you go out to buy the other entity. There's got to be a more compelling reason than just cost saving.
Yeah. Has to be.
Any other questions? Okay. Yeah.
Terrible.
Trouble. Yes, we have one.
No, not trouble. It's Alan Shepherd, IMS Health. I think the panel have done an excellent job in hitting some of the real key issues. Just taking that note on mergers and acquisitions, and it started with, I think it was Mohit at the beginning. If you look at all those mergers and acquisitions, they haven't increased market share. So for the generic industry, those mergers or those acquisitions have actually ensured that they stay in place in terms of market share. So it's an interesting dynamic which isn't there. Another aspect, just in terms of one of the key areas of wholesalers and the changing of distribution of generics, 200 generic molecules represent 88% of the value opportunity for wholesalers. Of those, about 60% of them are just simple plain release medicines. So they will have a power to negotiate in Europe, although for the other reasons, not all retail chains or not international coverage by the wholesale, but it will put pressure on generic companies to actually negotiate across the pond for product supply, even though the products will be different in each of the markets. And I have to say, it's lovely to see Rory as a new kid on the block. You know, it's interesting. But that's another observation. If you look at the panel names up there in terms of the companies, you know, you don't have to go many years back, and you wouldn't have seen those as actually names as major players. So the whole market is dynamic, which is one of the reasons that we got some real entrepreneurial people in there. But I'd also a note of caution. 80% of patients in most of the major therapeutic areas receive a generic medicine. That means if we do all focus on the biologics and biosimilars, two things could happen. One, there'll be a shortage of supply of those other generic medicines because, as someone said in the earlier presentation, if you chase cost, you won't get value, and you will start to destroy the sustainability of the generic industry. But there will be opportunities for smaller, innovative companies to fill that gap. So someone said generics are here forever. They are going to be here forever, but maybe in a different business model as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Alan. Just very quickly before we end this, I also wanted to get the panel's views on compliance. I think that's really been a big issue, and I looked through the number of FDA warning letters to trend it over the last 3 years. So back in 2010, the FDA issued 673 warning letters. That went up to 4,882 in 2012. And in 2013, so last year, there was 6,760. So you see a 10 times increase in 3 years. So compliance has really become quite an important piece in generics. And I just wanted to have the panel's view on this.
Just a short question, Rahul. These numbers that you have said, it's letters to generic industry, or
no? These are consolidated numbers. So these aren't only limited to generics, but we know that in terms of sheer numbers, a large proportion of those actually have gone to generic companies.
Okay.
Yeah, there's a crisis looming in the sector in that the prices we achieve for a lot of our products are low, and yet the quality requirements get higher. Every year they get higher. And that's not to say that they were substandard 2 or 3 years ago, but the regulators are almost trying to find a new thing to justify their own continued expansion. And there's a big problem at the moment, and I think most people are aware of it, around data integrity around a number of companies out in India. Which is a very insidious topic, because you can always clean a manufacturing suite, but if you think the data is being altered, that's a much more difficult problem to handle. And I think, there's already a shortage of medicine, significant shortage in the UK marketplace, because it depends on India for a lot of its volume. And what it's demonstrating to government is that there is a limit below which you're taking risks if you drive down the price of a pharmaceutical. A month's supply of simvastatin costs less than a Mars bar. There's something wrong with that. Like one is a medicine treating illness and the other is just a confectionery. So, and yet you're required to meet the same standard as the innovator of the product. So there is a crisis looming. And I think it's around the affordability of medicines rather than just the cheapness of the price. And I don't see a quick solution to this compliance issue. And interestingly, it's not just what you might call pure generic companies. It's brand companies with operations outside of their home base as well. So it's across the board. And, you know, some of the aspects of compliance that are now coming into play, the whole pharmacovigilance program, for instance, it seems like a whole load of work for nothing. Yeah, because doing pharmacovigilance on the generic that's been in the market for 20 years is daft. If something was going to show up, it would have shown up in 20 years. And we're all doing the same reports on the same molecules and sending them into the same agencies. And it's like a whirlwind and nobody said stop, because it hasn't generated a single extra safety for a European citizen, all this pharmacovigilance stuff. But we can all stand up and tell you how much money it costs us to run these programs. So there's a lack of clear thinking around some of these compliance measures.
Very well said.
Now, I got my bug off my chest.
Yeah, well done. Very well said. You pretty much said it all, actually. No, you pretty much said it all. But this is one of the biggest challenges for the generics market. You know, prices are coming down, healthcare costs coming down, whereas compliance and the costs going up. You know, it's just not tallying at the moment. And that's one of the biggest challenges that the industry has at the moment. Not to say, you know, you can take any shortcuts on GIP. I think that's absolutely key. It's a pharmaceutical product at the end of the day. Health is key. So, yeah. But well said, Roy. You pretty much hit the nail on the head, yeah.
And then, of course, we have the bribery part of compliance, which is also hitting the industry. Not what we heard about, big fees in Japan, and you read about that. I think it's good that we are having some rules and regulations in the pharma industry. I think we had gone too far with what we did. Too many doctors was basically dependent on salary from the pharma industry instead of doing their job in some countries. And I don't think that the generic industry was a driver. I don't think that we were really inventing that model. It was there already. But as a generic industry, we have less money to pay, so for us it's an advantage to have new rules. And I think it's also an advantage for the whole health environment to get cleaned up somehow. So I welcome the initiatives, even if some of them seems ridiculous. I'm not even able to give a pen to a doctor any longer because it's not relevant, they say. I can do some other things, but it's a little bit troublesome until I think we find the way to have a decent and nice and natural behavior with each other again. But it's I think it's for the better.
Yeah. Well, and as they say, the only thing constant is change, and the generic industry is sometimes its own worst enemy by pushing down prices to levels that, you know, make it unsustainable. But again, the opportunities that lie in the future, whether it's in terms of our emerging markets, whether it's in terms of compliance, whether it's in terms of branded products, there will always be a future for the brave. I'd like to thank the panel for their inputs, and if there are any questions, we'd be happy to take them. Okay, thank you.